covariance using joint probabilities. Covariance measures the degree of co-movement between a pair of variables. Let's have a look at an example. Suppose we have two stocks, stock A and B. Now there's three scenarios moving forward. So there's a 20% probability of scenario 1, in which case A would yield a return of 13% and B would yield a return of 7%. Scenario 2 has a 50% probability with 18% and 11% respective returns. And finally, scenario 3 has a 30% probability, in which case A would return 24 and B would return 16%. So the first thing we want to do is we want to calculate the average return or expected return of both stocks. So for stock A, we have the three scenarios here. So there's a 20% of scenario 1 occurring, in which case stock A would earn 13%. So you would repeat the process for scenario 2 and scenario 3. Therefore, the expected return for A would be 18.8. And similarly for stock B, the expected return would be 11.7%. The next step would be to calculate covariance itself. And you could see why we needed to calculate expected return first before we calculate covariance, because covariance measures the degree of movement between both stock A and B, but relative to their averages. So you can see how we're using the average rates of return in calculating covariance. And here's really what it says if we dive in a little deeper. What was A doing relative to its average? At the same time, what was B doing relative to its average? So if both stock A and B were above their averages, then both would be positive, and therefore if you multiply these two, their covariance would actually be positive as well, indicating that they move in the same direction. Similarly, if every time that A is below its average, therefore yielding a negative return, and B is below its average, then too, when you multiply these two together, you get positive covariance. So you could see why it's positive covariance, because they're both moving in the same direction. On the other hand, if A is above its average, in which case this would be positive, at the same time that B is below its average, then this term here would be negative. Then of course positive times negative would be negative, and that would indicate that these assets are moving in the opposite direction. So this is how we capture co-movement. Now the thing is, we got to do this for all scenarios. So this here represents just one observation. So what we have to do is we have to add up all observations, because remember in this case we had three scenarios. So this just represents like one scenario, and then we just keep adding it up until we have all three scenarios. But the other thing is, since each scenario has its own likelihood of occurring, we multiply the co-movement of each scenario by the probability of that scenario. So with the framework at hand, and this is what I mean by the framework, we can go ahead and plug in the numbers. So for scenario 1, A yielded 13%, and so what was that movement relative to its average? And that's captured by this term right here. Now at that same time, in other words, during that same scenario, what was B doing relative to its average? And there it is. And then finally, well, what was the probability of this observation? It was 20%. And so this top row works out to that. But then we have to look at the other scenarios as well. So we keep adding it up. And that's why we have the summation sign. So we got to add up all these observations for all the scenarios. So just very quickly for scenario 2, this is what A was doing relative to its average. At the same time, this is what B was doing relative to its average. And the probability of scenario 2 was 50%, so we get that number. And then finally in scenario 3, which is the last scenario, this is what A was doing relative to its average, while at the same time this is what B was doing relative to its average, and then we multiply it by the probability of scenario 3, we get this number. And so once we have all these three numbers, we would just add them up, and therefore we get 12.44. Now what's probably the biggest takeaway from the covariance number here is that this is positive, and that gives us an indication that generally A and B are moving in the same direction.